This is a tragic story that took place at West Denside Farm in Angus. The farm stands just over 5 miles north of the town of Broughty Ferry, which itself is a couple of miles to the east of Dundee in Scotland. I hope you enjoy this tragic tale. Thank you. The Smith family owned the farm of West Denside in 1826. David Smith and his wife Mary lived in the farmhouse with their 2 sons, Alexander and George, who worked on the farm. They also had 2 daughters. One of them married James Miller, the foreman on the farm. Also living at the house were 2 servants, Jean Norrie and Margaret Warden. Another servant, Barbara Small, lived nearby. The Smiths were respected and regarded as hard-working. Margaret Warden lost her father when she was only 15 years old, and she'd grown up with her widowed mother, sister and brother. Life was hard and money was tight for the Wardens, who received much sympathy in the area. The sister of Mrs. Smith, a woman called Mrs. McCann, had greatly supported the poor widow. It was Mrs. McCann who got Margaret a position as a servant at West Denside Farm. When Margaret was 21, she became pregnant, and the child's father was not on the scene. At this time, the pregnancy would have been a local scandal. An unmarried woman becoming pregnant was considered shameful. Margaret left West Denside and returned to her mother's to have the child. The pregnancy and birth of the baby would have strained the relationship between Margaret and the Smiths, her employers. But again, Mrs. McCann came to Margaret's rescue and smoothed things over, and Margaret was given her job back. Things returned to normal on the farm, but Margaret had caught someone's eye. The Smiths' youngest son, George, developed a crush on Margaret, and soon the two saw each other secretly, declaring their undying love for each other. The two had been carrying on a clandestine relationship for some time, when some local mentioned George and Margaret's relationship to Mrs. Smith. Mary Smith was outraged and appalled at the thought of her son George seeing, or even worse, marrying Margaret Warden, the daughter of a poor widow. Mary had high hopes for her 2 sons. She had long held dreams of her sons marrying into wealth and status, not some servant lass. Mary would not allow her plans for her sons to be ruined by the likes of Margaret Warden. When Mary learned of a rumour that Margaret was carrying George's child, she searched for her son and Margaret in a blind rage. Mary's fury was not towards both of the parents-to-be, as she had convinced herself that her poor innocent son had been seduced by this harlot, who'd already had a child born out of wedlock. She sent George away with a slight reprimand, but Mary let Margaret have it, calling her all the vile names she could think of, and blaming her for trying to ruin her son. A tearful, shaken Margaret left West Denside to return to her mother's. Mrs. Warden returned from working in the fields to find her daughter sobbing by the fireside. Despite the widow's questioning, Margaret would not tell her mother or brother what the matter was. The next day, Mary Smith had to take dairy produce to Dundee. On the way, she stopped at the Warden's house. When Mrs. Warden returned later on, she found Mary Smith and her daughter Margaret sat by the fire. Mary was trying to persuade Margaret to come to Dundee and visit a doctor with her, but Margaret was dead set against this. Mrs. Warden thought that Mary Smith believed Margaret had cholera, which was raging at the time. She surmised that's why Margaret had been sent from the Smiths' home, and that was why Mrs. Smith wanted Margaret to see a doctor. Margaret point-blankly refused to accompany her mistress. Mary asked Margaret's mother to go with her instead. On the way to Dundee, Mary told Mrs. Warden about Margaret's condition. They spoke of Margaret bringing shame to both the Smith and Warden households, and how the Smiths forgave Margaret for shamefully having one child. Mary also said that she was going to the doctor's to get something for herself and Margaret also. That night, when Margaret's mother returned and told her daughter about her conversation with Mary Smith, Margaret decided to face Mary's wrath and return to West Denside. When Margaret returned to the farm, most of the harvest had already been gathered, but one field, directly in front of the house, where the crop had taken a bit longer to ripen, was still to be harvested. Margaret and 2 sisters, Anne and Agnes Greer, were sent to gather the crop.
Explore Castle Menzies after dark.
Is it really haunted?
Is it really haunted?
Book now to find out.
If you dare.
Mary had decided that reducing Margaret's diet and hard work was the best remedy for Margaret's affliction. The three young women were busy working in the field, but the restricted diet and the physical labour took their toll on Margaret. She sat beside the unharvested wheat and told the other girls about her situation. Margaret talked of being pregnant and who the father was, her fears that George Smith would not stand by her, and her mistress's response. Margaret spoke of the time of her first unplanned pregnancy and said she could not go through all that again. As Margaret sat in the field, pouring her heart out, Mrs. Smith entered and walked towards the weeping woman. Mary Smith had brought a pot of tea and offered Margaret some. This act of kindness immediately affected Margaret, who cheered up and continued working after drinking the tea. The next day, Margaret was working in the field again. This time she was not much better fettle, perhaps thinking that being given the tea by Mary Smith was a breakthrough in the relationship between the two women, that Mary had come to terms with the pregnancy and might even accept Margaret as a daughter-in-law. That night, Margaret fell asleep by the kitchen fire at West Denside. Mary Smith walked into the room, carrying a glass and stirring it at the same time. She awoke Margaret and told Margaret and Jean Norrie, the other maid residing in the house, that she wanted the two women to taste what was in the glass. Mary took out the spoon and popped it into Jean's mouth. She then handed Margaret the glass, described as a large dram glass. Margaret drank all the contents and ate a piece of sugar Mary gave her. The two maids went to bed at 10 p.m. that night. Later, Jean was awoken. Margaret was not in her bed, but up and complaining of feeling unwell. The next day Margaret was too sick to go to work, and when Jean returned to the house at lunchtime, Margaret was still in bed, complaining that she had a sore side and her stomach was aching. Jean said that she thought her friend was dying, to which Margaret replied, "Some folk would be glad of that." Margaret's condition worsened the next day. She vomited repeatedly and spoke of having a raging thirst. Margaret called for her mother, and Mrs. Smith gave her medicine throughout the day. As Margaret's condition deteriorated, a worried Jean advised her not to take any more liquid from her mistress. Margaret blamed Mary Smith for her vomiting and talked of being deliberately poisoned by Mary. Margaret's mother and Anne Greer also witnessed this accusation. A Dr. Taylor from Broughty Ferry visited the sick woman. Before Taylor had seen Margaret, he was taken aside by Mary Smith, who told Taylor Margaret had been vomiting for 3 days. The doctor wondered why medical assistance had not been called for sooner, and asked if anything had been administered to the patient. Mary replied she had only given the sick woman castor oil. Mary told Dr. Taylor that she did not think the sickness was severe, and implied Margaret was an attention seeker. Mary also said that there was a rumour that Margaret was expecting a baby, and asked if violent sickness could affect the infant. Then Dr. Taylor was taken to see Margaret. When the doctor entered the room, Margaret had just finished vomiting. The doctor found her unresponsive and very weak. Her pulse and heart rate were low, and she was barely conscious. Margaret was just able to reply to Taylor's questioning, after he was forced to repeat it twice or thrice, as to how long she had been sick, but the doctor thought it unwise to ask any more questions. When the doctor left the kitchen, Mary pulled him aside, asking him what he thought of Margaret, and if he had administered any medicine. Dr. Taylor said that he thought Margaret would die in a few hours, and there was no point in giving her anything. Taylor also stated that the dying woman was about 3 months pregnant. After 3 days of suffering, Margaret Warden died at 9 p.m. on Friday the 8th of September, surrounded by her loved ones, her mother, Jean Norrie, and Anne Greer, all present. All had noticed the black appearance of Margaret's skin. The funeral was hastily arranged for Sunday the 10th. Margaret was brought here to the beautiful graveyard at Murrows. Her coffin had M.W. carved on it and her age, 25. She was buried in an unmarked grave, in a pauper's grave, somewhere within this site. Margaret's mother was suspicious about her daughter's death. She suspected foul play, but did not say anything as she thought it would not bring her daughter back. She also had a deep loyalty to the Smith family, especially Mary Smith's sister, who'd shown the Warden family great kindness. Dr. Taylor stated that death was due to cholera. Rumours began to circulate locally that Margaret had been murdered by her mistress. These stories reached the Sheriff of Forfarshire. He'd heard that the local gossip was that Mary had poisoned Margaret. He decided that the body should be lifted, despite the fact it had been underground for 20 days, and he wanted an autopsy carried out. On the 30th of September, Doctors Taylor, Ramsay and Johnson turned up here at the graveyard in Murrow's Church, and they carried out an autopsy on the body of Margaret Warden. They used this grave here as a makeshift table. They cut out a piece of the intestine and sent it for analysis. The result was that Margaret showed no sign of having died from cholera, but her body did contain large amounts of arsenic. It was also discovered that she was 3 to 4 months pregnant at the time she had died. Her body had deteriorated so much it was barely recognisable. The sheriff substitute arranged for the Smiths to go to Dundee for questioning, but on the day Mary Smith was too ill to travel. The Procurator Fiscal stated that he and the sheriff substitute would meet Mary Smith at 4 Mill House, an inn halfway between West Denside Farm and Dundee. Dr. Johnson travelled to West Denside Farm to ascertain Mary's condition. The doctor stated Mary was hysterical, but able to travel to the inn for questioning. Mary Smith gave a declaration to Christopher Kerr, one of the sheriff substitutes. In it she described Margaret's illness, when the sickness started, and talked of how ill her servant was. Mary denied knowing that Margaret was expecting a child, or had heard any rumour that Margaret was pregnant. Mary described Margaret as a rather loose character. Mary stated that she'd given the sick woman some castor oil she had bought from a chemist in Dundee, and administered it to Margaret with lozenges wine in a dram glass or tumbler. Mary said that to her knowledge there was no poison in the house at West Denside, except some used to kill rats. She did not know how the rodents were killed, as the rat catcher carried out that task himself, and the family had nothing to do with getting rid of these rodents. Mr. Kerr, after hearing Mary's statement, decided to commit her to jail in Dundee for further examination. Kerr took a second declaration by Mary Smith in Dundee on the 3rd of October 1826. In this second statement, Mary admitted getting from Mr. William Dick in Dundee something to put away rats. This substance, obtained from Mr. Dick, was bought on the Friday before Margaret Warden died. Mary stated that she told Mr. Dick's 2 daughters when they visited Denside Farm that she had a problem with rats, and asked them to inform their father that Mary would pick up the rat poison when she was next in Dundee. Mary stated she did not know what this substance was, and forgot she had asked for and collected rat poison when she made her first statement. Mary admitted mixing the poison with some meal on a plate in the kitchen. Margaret Warden was the only other person present at that time. Once mixed, Mary put the poison into the holes and cracks in the wall. Mary stated that rats infested West Denside, and the servants complained that they disturbed them in their beds. Mary was charged with murder, and her trial was scheduled to be held at the High Court in Edinburgh on the 28th of December 1826. Mary was defended by 2 prominent lawyers, Francis Jeffrey and Henry Coburn. Sir William Ray of St. Catherine's was acting for the Crown. He had come up against Geoffrey and Coburn before and hoped for a better outcome this time. William Ray was given details of the planned defence. It was to be argued that Margaret Warden had died by her own hand. She had committed suicide. Ray also learned that the defence had 41 witnesses to count on. He stated that he did not have enough time to prepare and asked for a new trial date. This request was granted, and the new date was set for the 5th of February 1827. The trial was disrupted when a jury member collapsed, and after receiving medical advice, the judge had to dismiss him. The rest of the jury were also dismissed and told to return to their jury duty on Monday. The defence jumped on this, stating that the jury had been officially dismissed, while the Crown argued that they had only been sent away to return to carry out their jury duty. The defence argued that a new jury member to replace the sick man could not be obtained from the original jury pool, as they had been openly discussing the case, and if a new jury were found, Mary Smith would be put under trial twice for the same crime, which at the time was unlawful under the Double Jeopardy Act. After a lot of legal toing and froing, a ballot decided which jury members would sit. Again, this was objected to by the defence, but their argument was repelled. Jean Norrie was called and asked if Margaret had ever threatened to kill herself. And Jean said that once Margaret had said she would surely do some ill to herself. Jean was also asked if she'd ever seen Margaret take drugs. And Jean said that she'd only ever seen Margaret take some pills that were given to her by Mary Smith. She was asked if there was any rats at the farm at West Denside. Jean said she'd never seen a rat until after Warden's death, and then she'd only seen one in the barn. Barbara Small lived on the farm with James Miller, the foreman of the farm, and his wife. Small said that she'd never heard her friend Margaret threaten to kill herself. She also said that she'd never seen any rats at West Denside. She stated that she often looked after the Millers' children and had never once been warned about the dangers of rat poison on the property. William Dick, a surgeon in Dundee, was well acquainted with the Smith family as he'd been the family doctor for a while. He admitted giving Mary Smith an ounce and a half of arsenic. He stated that this was enclosed on a piece of paper with arsenic written on it. It was tied with string, and Dick stated that he warned Mary Smith of the dangers of the contents of this package. He also sold Mary a small dose of laxative, but did not give her any castor oil. A Miss Jolly, a druggist in Dundee, admitted selling Mary Smith an ounce of castor oil. Thomas Brown, a 12-year-old herd boy who lived in the bothy of West Denside, stated that he had never seen or heard any rats, although he did admit to seeing a dead one in the barn. John Smith, who was no relation to the farm owners, stated that he did speak to Mary Smith once. Mary told him that there was some dead poultry and had blamed rats on killing these animals. The defence called their witnesses. The first were doctors, and they talked about Mary Smith's health immediately after Margaret Warden's death. All of the doctors agreed that Mary Smith was in no fit state mentally to give a declaration at 4 Mile House. Andrew Murray, a rat catcher, told of being employed at West Denside to kill rats. He stated that he had found traces of rats there. He called them the small Scots rat, although he admitted he did not see any. Murray also stated he used poison at the farm, and 3.5 years ago he had left some poison with instructions how to mix it with oatmeal. The foreman, James Miller, stated that he had seen rats about the farm, and William Sturrock, a Wright, had a conversation in June 1826 with Mary Smith about rats at West Denside. Mary noted that she would have to get rid of them. Mrs. Hamilton was a hawker who travelled the countryside with a young boy selling matches. Hamilton told the court that she was often given lodgings in the barn. Hamilton talked of being taken to the barn by Margaret Warden 2 or 3 weeks before she died. When Hamilton asked after Margaret, she burst into tears. The sobbing woman told the hawker that she was not able for her work and was getting rough treatment from her mistress, Mary Smith. Margaret Warden talked of killing herself. The defence tried to suggest that Margaret had sent the hawker boy to Dundee to purchase poison for her. Robert Esson, a merchant in Broughty Ferry, told the court that he remembered a boy coming into his shop to buy £2 worth of arsenic. The merchant refused and told the boy to try the doctor's. The prosecution summed up the case. Sir William Ray stated that it was ludicrous to think that Margaret Warden had killed herself with arsenic. He stated that Margaret had already been through the shame of having an illegitimate child before, and to take her life because she was pregnant a second time was just nonsense. He also pointed out that Margaret had a young son to look after. He stated that Mary Smith had access to arsenic. He also pointed out that no one seemed to think there was a problem with rats on the farm, so buying this arsenic for a rat problem was just nonsense. Even the rat catcher did not see any rats at West Denside. Mr. Jeffrey then stood for the defence and asked the jury to find the panel not guilty, reasoning that Mary Smith had no motive for killing Margaret Warden. He talked about the calm and cheerful way in which Mary looked after Margaret when she was ill. Jeffrey also stated there was no evidence that Mary bore Margaret any hostility, and he queried that Margaret had died from arsenic, stating he could place little reliance on a test to discover poison. The lawyer thought if arsenic had been given to Mary, she would not have lingered on for so long before finally dying. Jeffrey said that if arsenic had killed Margaret, she had probably administered the poison to herself. With the Crown and the defence having finished their closing statements, the jury retired to consider all the evidence. They were instructed to have a verdict by 2 p.m. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the jury returned and an envelope was passed to the judge. The head juror was then asked to give a verdict, and a unanimous verdict of not proven was given. The judge turned to Mary Smith and dismissed her. Mary stood up and left the court, free to return to West Denside. So did Mary Smith murder her servant, Margaret Warden? Well, I think she definitely did. She had the means and the motive. She did not want Margaret to have this baby with her son George and bring shame on the Smith family. Also, this would mean that George would have to marry Margaret, denying his chance of marrying somebody of his own station. Mary also had the means. She had access to poison from her friend in Dundee. I think that Mary Smith was a very, very lucky woman indeed. Hope you've enjoyed this programme. Thank you. If you've enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe. You might like to take one of our dark history tours, ghost tours, or paranormal investigations that are held in Perthshire, Glasgow and Stirling. If so, please visit our website, which is www.historyandhorrortours.com. Thank you.